In 1883, a Canadian Pacific Railway cook fed 200 men 3 meals a day for about 40 cents a head. No refrigeration, no supply trucks, just a canvas tent, a sheet iron stove, and whatever the tote road delivered. Yet those men laid over 6 miles of track in a single day on that food. Number 14 on this list kept entire work gangs alive in the Fraser Canyon when the company stores failed them. And number 3 was so prized that camps reportedly lost men to rival contractors over it. These meals built a country 1 mile at a time, and almost nobody remembers them. Because here is the truth. The men who drove the last spike at Craigalachie were powered by food you would not recognize today. Hit subscribe, because your great-grandfather probably ate half of this list. Let us count down. Number 25, lard pail tea. Before the cook tent even took shape, the tea was already boiling. Camp cooks brewed it in recycled 5-pound lard pails hung over open fires, dumping in loose black tea by the fistful and letting it roll until it turned the color of creosote. No strainer, no milk most weeks, just a tin cup and tea strong enough to dissolve a man's exhaustion. Navvies earning $1.50 a day drank it at 5 in the morning before the first cut, again at the noon whistle, and again when the light died. Old-timers swore a pail black with years of boiling meant tea that would stand a spoon upright. When enamel teapots and tin caddies arrived with the settled towns, the lard pail vanished. But for 4 years of construction, that battered pail was the heartbeat of every camp from Bonfield to the Pacific. Number 24, hardtack. The biscuit that traveled where bread could not. Square, pale, and hard enough to crack a tooth, hardtack came west in wooden crates stacked beside the blasting powder, and the men joked you could confuse the two. Each biscuit was flour and water baked to the texture of shale, built to survive months in a freight car or a canoe. Workers softened it in tea, fried it in pork grease, or pounded it into crumbs for thickening stew. In the rock country north of Lake Superior, where supply lines stretched thin across muskeg that swallowed entire locomotives, hardtack was sometimes the only bread for weeks. It cost the contractors pennies a pound, and it never spoiled, never froze, never failed. Fresh bread killed it the moment camps got proper ovens. But hardtack got the railway through the shield, one jaw-aching bite at a time. Number 23, Sobelly. Salt pork was the engine oil of the entire enterprise. Thick slabs of fat pork cured in brine barrels, shipped by the ton, and fried, boiled, or eaten cold at every single meal. The men called it Sobelly, and they ate it until they dreamed about it. A barrel cost the contractor around $12 and fed a gang for a week, so it never left the menu. Cooks fried it crisp for breakfast, dropped chunks into the bean pot at noon, and rendered the fat to fry everything else. Diaries from the Superior section record men going months without fresh meat, sustained almost entirely on pork fat and flour. But a man swinging a spike maul 10 hours a day burned 6,000 calories, and Sobelly delivered them cheaper than anything on earth. When refrigerated cars finally rolled on the very rails these men laid, fresh beef ended the reign of the brine barrel forever. Number 22, blackstrap molasses. The men called it long sweetening, and it went on absolutely everything. White sugar was costly and vanished fast from camp stores, but blackstrap molasses arrived in wooden kegs and cost next to nothing. Cooks poured it over porridge, baked it into beans, smeared it on bannock, and stirred it into tea when the sugar ran out. What nobody knew then is what makes this entry remarkable now. Blackstrap is loaded with iron, calcium, and potassium, exactly the minerals a laborer loses through sweat. The camp stumbled into nutrition by accident of price. A keg lasted weeks, and a cook who ran dry of molasses faced a quieter, angrier mess tent. Corn syrup and cheap white sugar wiped it from Canadian tables within a generation. But for the men of the grade, that thick black ribbon falling from the jug was the sweetest thing between Winnipeg and the sea. Number 21, oatmeal porridge. Every morning, across 2,000 miles of construction, the same sound. A long-handled spoon scraping the bottom of a cauldron of oats. Porridge was breakfast's foundation because oats were cheap, light to freight, and impossible to ruin completely. The cook started it before dawn, thick enough to hold its shape on a tin plate, served with molasses and sometimes a splash of condensed milk from the tin. A 100-weight sack cost about $2 and fed a camp for days. The men grumbled, but the engineers noticed something the grumblers did not. Gangs-fed porridge worked steadier through the morning than gangs-fed only fried pork. Slow-burning fuel, they would call it now. Back then, the cook just knew that a quiet mess tent at 6 meant a full mile of grade by noon. When boxed cereals reached the prairies in the early 1900s, the great camp cauldrons went cold for good. Number 20, dried apple duff. Fresh fruit was a fantasy in a construction camp, but dried apples came west by the crate, leathery rings strung on twine or packed in barrels. The cook soaked them overnight until they swelled back to something like fruit, folded them into a flour and sweet dough, tied the whole thing in a flour sack, and boiled it for hours. Out came duff, a dense, steaming pudding sliced thick and drowned in molasses sauce. The men had an unprintable rhyme about dried apples and what they did to a man's stomach. But on a Sunday in the Selkirks, with snow piling against the cook tent, a slab of hot apple duff was the closest thing to home most of these men would taste for a year. And it disappeared the moment fresh fruit could ride the rails the workers themselves had laid. Number 19, PEA soup. Follow the Ottawa Valley Cruise and the French-Canadian Axeman west, and you follow the smell of pea soup. Yellow split peas, a chunk of salt pork, an onion, if fortune allowed, simmered in a cauldron until thick enough to plaster a wall. This was the dish of the timber camps of Quebec, moved wholesale onto the railway grade, carried by men whose fathers and grandfathers had eaten it in the shanties since before Confederation. The English-speaking workers even called the French Canadians pea soupers, and the men wore the insult like a badge because their soup was better than anything the English cooks produced. Peas cost 3 cents a pound, kept forever, and a single pot fed 40 men. The soup pot never fully emptied. It just got topped up day after day, growing richer. It survives in Quebec kitchens still. But the camp version, thick with pork and wood smoke, vanished with the shanties that birthed it. Number 18. Now here is where things get interesting. Mulligan stew. Every camp had a pot, and the pot had no recipe. Mulligan was whatever existed, combined. Salt pork, the end of yesterday's beans, a shot partridge, potatoes going soft, hardtack crumbs for thickening, all simmered into a brown, anonymous, magnificent whole. The name came over with the Irish navvies, and the dish followed the steel across the entire continent. Here is the part the railway companies never advertised. Mulligan existed because the contractor supply system kept failing. When the tote roads washed out or the pork barrels ran low, the cook made mulligan or the men made trouble, and a camp of 200 angry men with blasting powder was a serious consideration. Strikes over food were real. Crews walked off the Onderdonk sections more than once when rations collapsed. Mulligan stew was the buffer between the company's logistics and open revolt. A pot of scraps literally kept the railway moving. Number 17. Salt cod. It seems impossible codfish from the Atlantic, eaten in the mountains of British Columbia. But salt cod was the great protein traveler of the 19th century. Stiff as a board, light as kindling, immune to time. Crates of it rode the supply trains to end of steel, and then went forward by wagon and pack horse. The cook soaked the boards overnight in the river, changing the water to draw the salt, then flaked the fish into a pot with potatoes and pork scraps, finished with fried salt pork bits poured over top. scruncheons, as the Newfoundlanders and Maritimers in the gangs called them. For the East Coast men swinging hammers 3,000 miles from home, the smell of that pot was pure homesickness. Fresh fish from mountain rivers eventually shamed the salt boards off the menu, and refrigeration finished the job. But for a few years, Atlantic cod helped drive steel through the Rockies. Number 16. Tinned corned beef. The future arrived in the camps inside a rectangular can. By the early 1880s, canned corned beef was pouring out of packing houses, and contractors loved it. No barrels, no brine, no spoilage, just stack the cases and go. The men were less romantic. They called it canned horse, canned mule, and worse, and ate it anyway, fried into hash with potatoes and onions until the edges crisped. On the remote sections where even pork barrels could not reach, corned beef hash was supper for weeks running. Here is the detail that gets forgotten. This was many workers' first encounter with industrial food. Meat from an animal nobody in camp had seen, slaughtered 1,000 miles away. The railway was building the very system that would fill Canadian pantries with cans for the next century. The men eating canned horse beside the unfinished grade were tasting the future they were constructing. Number 15. Sourdough flapjacks. The cook's most precious possession was not his knives. It was a crock of fermenting starter, kept warm beside the stove by day and sometimes taken into his blankets on freezing nights, because if the starter died, breakfast died with it. Sourdough needed no store-bought yeast, no fresh milk, nothing but flour, water, and care. Each dawn the cook ladled batter onto a greased stovetop the size of a door and flipped flapjacks by the hundred, stacked them in steaming towers, and let the men drown them in molasses. The faint sour tang was the taste of every Western camp, from rail grade to Gold Creek. The prospectors of the next decade would literally be nicknamed sourdoughs. Commercial baking powder and packaged yeast murdered the tradition by the new century. The flapjack survived. The living crock beside the stove, and the cook who slept with it, did not. Number 14. Rice and dried salmon. And here, the story turns serious. More than 15,000 Chinese workers built the most lethal stretch of the entire railway, the Fraser Canyon and the mountains beyond. And they did it on rice, dried salmon, and tea. They were paid $1 a day, while white workers earned $1.50 to $2.50. And, unlike white workers, were forced to buy their own food. Chinese crews pooled their wages, appointed their own cooks, and ate communally from great pots of rice and salted fish. Their diet was in some respects superior. The tea they drank meant boiled water, while white camps drank from contaminated streams and suffered dysentery. But when winter cut the supply lines and fresh vegetables disappeared entirely, scurvy swept the Chinese camps, and the contractors provided no doctors. Hundreds died of disease, cold, and explosions. The old saying held that a Chinese worker died for every mile of the canyon. Every bowl of rice eaten on that grade was paid for out of a wage half the size of the man working beside him. Remember that the next time someone calls the railway a triumph of engineering alone. Number 13. Slumgullion. If mulligan stew was supper, slumgullion was what happened to supper the next day. The word came up from the American camps and meant something between a hash and a confession. Yesterday's stew thinned with water, fortified with crumbled hardtack, fried potatoes, bean dregs, anything the cook refused to waste. Served at noon to men who had been driving spikes since first light. It was hot, it was filling, and it asked no questions. But waste was the one sin a camp cook could not commit. Flour came 800 miles by rail, wagon, and barge, and throwing food away was throwing away freight some teamster had nearly drowned delivering. Slumgullion was thrift with a terrible name and a loyal following. It died without a funeral when settled towns brought ice boxes and regular butchers. Nobody mourned it. Everybody who ate it remembered it. Number 12. CPR strawberries. The men had a sense of humor. And this is the proof. Fresh strawberries existed nowhere within 500 miles of most camps, but stewed prunes appeared on the table morning, noon, and night, so the navvies christened them CPR strawberries. And the name stuck so hard it followed the railway into the next century. Railroaders were still using it decades later. The cook simmered dried prunes in water and molasses until they collapsed into a sweet, dark mush. Prunes were cheap and indestructible in shipping, and the cooks knew they were the only reliable answer to a diet of pork fat and white flour. But the nickname is the real treasure here, a whole vocabulary of camp slang, born trackside, seasoned with sarcasm, almost entirely forgotten. The prunes survive in grocery stores. The name that made 200 exhausted men grin over breakfast does not. Number 11. Camp bread. The arrival of a proper sheet iron camp stove, hauled in pieces over the tote road, changed everything because it meant bread. Real bread, raised with sourdough or precious yeast cakes, baked in pans through the night by a cook who effectively never slept. A big camp went through 100 loaves a day, and the cook's helper, the cookie, often a boy of 14 earning his first wages, spent half his life feeding the firebox to keep the oven steady. The smell of baking bread drifting over a sea of tents at 4 in the morning was, by every account that survives, the finest thing in camp life. A cook whose bread failed lost the men's respect by Thursday and his job by Sunday. When the towns rose along the finished line, bakeries took the work, and the all-night camp oven went cold, remembered only by the cookies who grew old telling stories about it. Number 10. Game stew. Some weeks, the wilderness itself fed the railway. Camps hired hunters or simply benefited from a foreman who could shoot, and a moose meant 600 pounds of fresh meat in a world of salt pork. The cook dropped great chunks into the cauldron with onions and potatoes and let it go all day, and the news traveled down the grade faster than the telegraph. Fresh meat tonight. Indigenous hunters and provisioners supplied many camps, a contribution written almost nowhere in the official record, though the railway was cutting straight through their territories and destroying the buffalo economy as it went. A bowl of moose stew after 2 months of sowbelly was, one navvy wrote home, worth more than a day's pay. No store ever sold it, no menu ever listed it. It was the country itself, served in a tin bowl. Number 9. Boiled raisin duff. Sunday in camp meant 2 things, a half-day's rest if the schedule allowed, and pudding. Raisin duff, the spotted dog of the British camps reborn on the Canadian grade, was flour, suet, and raisins boiled in a cloth sack until it emerged dense, glistening, and heavy as a curling stone. The cook sliced it thick and poured over a sauce of molasses and butter. Raisins came west by the crate and survived anything, and suet came off the pork and beef the camp already had. The duff cost the contractor almost nothing and bought more goodwill than a wage rise. Veterans of the construction years remembered the Sunday duff with a precision they could not summon for the wages, the weather, or sometimes the year. Sweetness in a hard place gets remembered. The duff vanished with the steamed puddings of the old country. Number 8. Donuts. Here is the entry nobody expects. The camp cook's secret weapon, his reputation, his job security, was the donut. Fried by the 100 in a kettle of boiling lard, rolled in sugar when sugar existed, the men called them sinkers, and a cook who fried good sinkers was famous up and down the line. They traveled in a pocket and survived a day on the grade. Now the part that sounds invented but is documented in camp lore across the era. Men chose camps by the cooking, and contractors knew it. Word that the cook at Mile 87 fried sinkers every morning moved men more reliably than a 10-cent raise. Cooks were poached between outfits like star athletes. The donut, of all things, was a recruiting tool in the building of a transcontinental railway. Tim Hortons would not exist for another 80 years. The connection between Canadians, hard work, and a donut that was already laid down with the track. Number 7. Beef on the hoof. The biggest camp solved the fresh meat problem in the oldest way imaginable. They walked it there. Contractors drove cattle herds alongside the advancing steel, grazing them on prairie wool by day and slaughtering as needed. On the prairie section in 1883, where track gangs were laying 3, 4, even 6 miles of steel a day, thousands of men needed meat that no barrel could supply. The camp butcher killed in the evening. The cook roasted and stewed through the night, and the men ate beef at dawn that had been grazing at sunset. The stew was simple: beef, potatoes, onions, thickened with flour, and after months of sow-belly, it tasted like a coronation. When the last spike went in and refrigerated cars began rolling, the walking larder was finished forever. The railway, in its final irony, made its own herds obsolete. Number 6. Baking powder biscuits. When sourdough was too slow and the men were already lining up, the cook reached for baking powder, and in 20 minutes a mountain of hot biscuits hit the table. Split, buttered when butter existed, and flooded with molasses, or the new golden corn syrups arriving from the east, biscuits and syrup was a meal in itself and a side to everything else. The camps adopted baking powder the way the grade adopted dynamite. A cookie could be trusted with biscuits before he could be trusted with bread. Cold biscuits with a slab of sow-belly inside became the original Canadian field lunch. Every prairie grandmother kept the tradition alive for another 3 generations, which is why this entry might be the one your own family made without ever knowing where it came from. The camps are gone. The biscuit somehow nearly is too. Number 5. Bean hole beans. One more turn, and this one is pure genius. The finest beans in camp never touched the stove. The cook dug a pit, burned hardwood down to coals, lowered in a cast iron pot of soaked beans, salt pork, and molasses, sealed the lid, shoveled earth over the whole thing, and walked away for an entire night. Underground, in that buried oven, the temperature held perfectly steady for 12 hours. No scorching, no stirring, no attention. Modern food science explains what the cooks knew by instinct. Long, low, moist heat breaks down the beans completely while the molasses and pork render into a glaze a restaurant would struggle to copy. The technique came down from the lumber shanties of Quebec and the Maritimes. Men woke to the cook hauling a steaming pot out of the earth like buried treasure. A $200 slow cooker today does exactly what a hole in Canadian ground did for free in 1884. Number 4. Saskatoon pie. For a few short weeks each summer, the prairie turned purple, and the camps noticed. Saskatoon berries grew wild in tangled thickets along every coulee and riverbank, and on Sundays men picked berries into lard pails like schoolboys. Indigenous peoples had harvested and dried Saskatoons for generations, pounding them into pemmican, and prairie cooks learned the berries' worth fast. Back in camp, the cook rolled lard pastry and baked the only fresh fruit pie most of these men would see all year. Deep purple, almond-scented, unlike anything in England or Quebec. A slice of Saskatoon pie at the end of steel, hundreds of miles from the nearest orchard, was the prairie introducing itself. The berry never industrialized. It bruises too easily to ship, which is exactly why most Canadians outside the prairies have still never tasted one. The thickets the navvies picked are, in many places, still there, purple every July, waiting beside the main line. Number 3. Raisin pie. And here is the one that moved men. If the donut built a cook's reputation, raisin pie made him a legend. Raisins, simmered with molasses, a squeeze of vinegar for sharpness, thickened and sealed in lard pastry, produced a pie so rich and reliable it earned the grim nickname funeral pie back east. In the camps it meant one thing: payday for the soul. Camp lore from the construction era is full of the same story told a dozen ways, of men quitting one outfit for another up the line, because word came down that the cook there baked pie twice a week. Contractors fighting for scarce labor in the mountains understood that pastry was policy. A cook who could produce pie at end of steel with flour hauled by packhorse and a stove balanced on stumps held more practical power over morale than the paymaster. Thousands of miles of track got laid a little faster because somewhere ahead there was pie. That is not nostalgia. That is logistics. Number 2, bannock. The simplest food on this list is also the oldest and the most Canadian. Flour, water, a little fat, a pinch of salt and leavening, mixed in minutes and baked in a frying pan against a fire on a green stick or in the ashes themselves. Bannock came from Scottish fur traders and was adopted, transformed, and made their own by Indigenous and Métis peoples across the entire Northwest, decades before a single rail was laid. By the 1880s, it was the universal bread of the country the railway was crossing, and the camps ran on it whenever ovens failed, supplies thinned, or crews worked ahead of the line. A man could carry flour and fat in a sack and make bread anywhere on earth. Bannock outlived the camps and survives today in Indigenous communities and northern kitchens as living history, which is more than almost anything else here can claim. The country was measured out one chain at a time by men with bannock in their packs. Number 1, pork and beans. There was never any suspense about this. Beans were the railway. Beans at breakfast, beans at noon carried cold in a lunch pail, beans at supper, beans baked, boiled, fried, and resurrected into hash. A navvy on the Lake Superior section could go a full month in which beans appeared at every single meal. The economics were unanswerable. Beans cost 3 cents a pound dry, tripled in weight when soaked, married perfectly with the salt pork already in every camp, and delivered the protein and slow-burning energy that built grade mile after mile. The bean pot never left the stove. Men cursed beans, sang about beans, and then they laid steel across muskeg, granite, prairie, and 3 mountain ranges in 4.5 years, fueled overwhelmingly by this one humble dish. The last spike at Craigalachy has a national memorial. The bean pot that got everyone there has nothing, until now. So here is my challenge. Pick one. Bake beans with molasses and salt pork, low and slow this weekend. Fry a bannock, stew prunes, and call them CPR strawberries in front of your family and tell them why. Then come back and tell me in the comments which one you made and whether your grandparents ever talked about any of these. Because these were not just meals. They were the fuel that built this country, 1 mile at a time. And the men and women who cooked them deserve to be remembered alongside the men who drove the spikes. Your great-grandfather knew these dishes. Now you do too.